Welcome to the Damcasters. I'm your host, Matt Bone. As the RAF looked to rearmament in the years following Hitler's rise to power, the youngest service had to face the growing pains of any organisation that required rapid expansion. The issue they faced was that the decisions they took would leave them with the tools to fight the next war. While the popular memory of the Spitfire Summer of 1940 is fixed in many people's minds, the route to it was torturous, and the focus of the RAF's leadership was on the bomber, not the fighter. In his new book, Rearming the RAF for the Second World War, historian Adrian Phillips looks at the political factors that would give the RAF the Spitfire Hurricane in Lancaster, but also would mean it would enter the fight with Battles, Gladiators, and Whitleys. To set the scene, I asked Adrian just what sort of force the RAF was when attention turned to equipping it for the next conflict.
It was pretty much two air forces. One was the actual working air force out in India and the other remote bits of the empire, which was doing a counterinsurgency job, which was live and which to a great extent hadn't really changed since the very beginning of the 1920s. And the other one was, in the jargon, the Metropolitan Air Force, which was the UK-based fighters and bombers that were supposed to protect Britain, which had been built up on pretty much a theoretical-only basis and was really the showpiece of the independent Royal Air Force.
And I think that's where things start getting really interesting, is as you sort of go into great detail, Trenchard came out of, he inherited the command. You make that great line about him being the stepfather of the RAF as opposed to the father itself. And he was the striking force commander, so his mindset was very much bombers striking. So that's where him, along with many other air forces, are putting their stead as they start looking towards the next conflict.
Very, very much so. And there is a mixture of office politics in that the bombers are the big thing that keep the RAF an autonomous force, and a vision of what the next war is going to be like, which nobody had an absolutely clear forecast of, but certainly most people, when pushed, would have said that the next war is going to be a bomber war.
And let's delve into this a little bit. So what were the sort of internal conflicts in the beginning 30s there as they start defining what this next war is going to be? What are the sort of differing requirements from each of the commands? Because you have, well, let's break them down. What commands make up the RAF at the time that rearmament starts being discussed?
The crucial ones are Bomber Command and then Fighter Command. Being utterly cynical, Coastal Command is there to keep the admirals a bit happy, but not spend too much money on them, and Training Command is obviously a necessary adjunct. One of the striking things is that when the Air Defence of Great Britain is split into Bomber and Fighter Command in 1936, the head of ADGB, Air Marshal Steele, becomes merely the head of Bomber Command, which you'd think was kind of a demotion, but there was no sign of that. Bomber Command was really the big ticket, the high profile heart of the Royal Air Force. Fighter Command was kind of ambiguous and something that the Air Staff was a little uncertain about. But Bomber Command was the thing that was going to do the RAF's big job and win the war.
And that's very much the same as all the other air forces in the world are thinking, because you've got Mitchell espousing the same thing in the States, the duet thing, which doesn't really come into most people's thinking until much later. But you then have politicians like Stanley Baldwin saying the bomber is always going to get through. So it is very much being seen as, well, both from a propaganda perspective and from an actual perspective, that's where all the focus and where the money is going to go, which is where most of this conversation is going to be.
I think the big exception, of course, is Germany, where certainly there is a strong strategic dimension to the thinking of Luftwaffe, but in practice, It's built up in a completely different way, certainly to the Royal Air Force. It's a mobile, flexible force, which in practice is attached to army units. Yes, it has got strategic bombing as one of its missions, but it's also configured for maximum flexibility and to operate along with the army. Which includes providing direct support for Army ground operations, which is utterly different to the way the Royal Air Force was being structured.
Is that because the RAF are thinking that they will be essentially defending an island nation as opposed to fighting more of a land war with the expectation of France holding on?
Yeah, and certainly along with the Stanley Baldwin, the bomber will always get through sentiment, is the fact that unspoken mostly, but taken as an absolute fact, that Britain would no longer be sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers over to the continent to get killed. And that was almost one of the givens of British defence planning right up to about March 1939. So the reason why the RAF is not geared up for army support begins with the assumption that the army won't really be doing much in the next war.
And I guess for that generation of politicians who'd fought in the First World War, that was something to avoid, wasn't it? It was very much on their mindset, being haunted by that experience.
Yeah, the number of politicians who were prepared to accept the risk of war of any kind was tiny. In practice, Winston Churchill. No, the anti-war instinct was so universal and so strong that it was reluctantly and painfully that the politicians started to rearm in 1934 when they worked out that Hitler was actually a menace.
So let's dig into this a little bit, because we've got a couple dimensions there. We mentioned it earlier on about how the RAF is being used as colonial policing. So it is very much focused as a bomber force. Most of the frontline aircraft have bombs on them of some sort, not like we would come to understand in the years to come, very, very small payloads. But you've also got the Fleet Air Arm thrown in there as well. And that is a sort of inter-service hot potato and one of Trenchard's great coups to get his hands on that, wasn't it?
Well, it started off that way when the Royal Air Force was formed in 1918, at a stage when carrier aviation was in its absolute infancy. Nobody was in a position to foretell just how important the carrier-borne aircraft was going to be as the main weapon in naval warfare. And that would have involved a vision of forecasting that just was not there. So compared to the US Navy and the Imperial Japanese Navy, because they didn't have an air arm to play with, the British Sea Lords really didn't have that same vision. So this is one of the great weaknesses of the Royal Navy as it goes into the Second World War, that its air arm is very, very underdeveloped, both in terms of the kit it has and also the philosophy and operational planning.
So with the sort of focus starting to look to the next conflict, one of the things your book does very well is break down each of those sort of planning stages and sort of procurement rounds that go into it. But what is this sort of situation that the RAF goes through as they start to rearm, as Hitler comes to the ascendancy from 1933 on? The various lettered schemes that you go into detail in your book, because they seem to follow on, but then change the playing surface a little bit each time they go along. What are the sort of basic requirements that they're trying to follow?
Well, there are two things. First of all, to modernise the Royal Air Force, and secondly, to strengthen it. So in the very early schemes, one of the big priorities is to replace the biplane bombers, the Hearts, which have been the heart of, it wasn't Bomber Command in those days, but the RAF's bomber force. So the first thing to do was get in urgently something that was better than, in effect, First World War grade aeroplanes. And then the next thing, which was linked, was to build up the strengths of the Air Force. I suspect, though, that somewhere along the way you got people missing out what was really needed to be done. I'm afraid the fairy battle is the key part of it, because when you scratch the surface, the fairy battle was simply a hawker heart built according to modern technology for the day. So it was an improvement on the heart, which was certainly needed, but it was not an aeroplane which was going to fight any war that anybody could imagine.
Yes, the poor old fairy battle. Got the worst Merlin, got the short end of just about every stick. But we won't get into that. It gets beaten enough, doesn't it? One of the things that I loved in the book is the intelligence aspect. This trying to figure out just how big the Luftwaffe is, and then that being used to make the RAF as big as it possibly can be as well. Would you be able to talk to that a little bit? The sort of the games that are played on the various visits, from sort of Milch coming over here and the RAF going to Germany, because it's classic sleight of hand that sort of plays into people's hands because they're willing to believe it.
Absolutely. Well, I think it goes right back to one of the most unfortunate parts of rearmament, which is the fact that it was the RAF itself, and the person of the Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Edward Ellington, who didn't think that the Germans would be able to build up a strong air force. And this was just because he thought it was impossible. There was no intelligence behind it. And in fact, he was working against what intelligence that there was available. The next stage, as that resistance got broken down, was to look at the Luftwaffe essentially as a bomber force. So the way the data on the Luftwaffe got processed through the British system was to look at it in terms of something whose job was to bomb London flat, which was not the case, but that's how the equation was twisted. And then the Germans started playing games. As you mentioned, Erhard Milch, and he was the guy who was in charge of the nuts and bolts of building up the Luftwaffe to a much greater extent than Goering. And he realised that the British had got the wind in their sails and were building up a big air force. So he thought, well, let's calm them down. Let's pretend that we're not building as large an air force as we are. So there's great charade when he whisks of some visiting air marshals off, and with great ceremony opens his safe and brings out his books of the fiction in. And I'm afraid to say that this struck a chord with me, because I used to, many years ago, be an investment analyst covering German companies. And it was the great danger sign when any company did this kind of charade and pantomime that you knew you were being lied to. But sadly, these guys didn't. So what happened was that the scheme that was being worked on at the time, I think it was Scheme H, got pulled in cabinet by the air minister, just because the supposed assumptions of Luftwaffe size behind it had been knocked on the head by Milch's little performance.
So how was that impacting those numbers? Because you go through the quite set criteria of number of bombers to number of fighters, because it's very much weighed toward bombers. And how is each of these intelligence briefings, charades from Milch when he does his thing, how does that impact what that ratio is going to be?
The brutal fact is that the RAF, between the wars, possibly well into the war, had a very low opinion of fighters. And there is a great line from Trenchard saying, in effect, that fighters will do to scare off the, quote, rabbits amongst the German bombers. It's almost as though this is a concession that the Royal Air Force is forced to make to keep the politicians and the public amused. There is very little sense that there is actually a defined military task of inflicting casualties on attacking German bombers that will reduce the tonnage of bombs falling on Britain, and ideally stop the attacks happening at all. I'm afraid one of the weakest parts of the RAF's planning before the war, that at the top level of the air staff, there's no very clear idea what fighters should be doing. The great mercy is, of course, the first commander of Fighter Command, Hugh Dowding, did. He fully understood his job. He knew what he needed to do with the RAF's fighters, and he did it very, very well, fortunately.
And it's sort of a stroke of luck. He was in the technology branch before he took command of Fighter Command as well, wasn't he? So he knew what was coming through in the pipeline, whether it be what became RDF, things like that. He knew what the tools were that were coming to put them together.
Absolutely. I know the crucial thing was RDF, radar, as we know now. So he'd seen it developing. And so he was in a position to ride out the skepticism, and there was outright skepticism about RDF in at the higher reaches of the air staff. And the other crucial thing about what Dowding did was, technologically, certainly RDF was the key tool, but the vital thing is that it was integrated into a very thoroughly thought out command and control system by which Fighter Command's aircraft would respond to a very well structured control system into which RDF and other reporting systems would be fed to create a coherent picture of the aerial battlefield that the commanders could work with. And as well as RDF, you had direction finding so that the ground controllers knew where the RAF's fighters were, and you had VHF radio by which they could be instructed. So yes, RDF was the very big part of the technological picture, but it was merely one of three crucial technologies, and above all, it was integrated into this powerful and robust command and control system.
There's a section in your book which is sort of comparing and contrasting that with how Bomber Command are starting to ramp up. And it's very stark that Bomber Command as a force are not thinking along those sort of strategic levels. They're very much thinking about numbers and targets on a tactical level. Was there anything done to address that, or was that just left to go because they were a bomber force, they were going to smash through and bomb Germany to cinders?
I'm afraid to say the interpretation you have to come up with is that as far as the RAF top brass went, it was so self-evidently a truth that bombers were going to win the war that you didn't really need to think how they were going to win the war. It was very much a single piece of hardware-driven way of thinking, that provided you had the bombers there with the range, the defensive armament and the bomb capacity, that was what you needed, and all you needed. So it was serious military thinking was pretty much absent.
Which is remarkable considering what they were proposing to do. Something that had never been done at scale, and yet there's a lack of application to the thought of how it was going to be done.
It is bizarre, and one of the most distinguished aviation historians, Williamson Murray, made the point that given the RAF's raison d'etre of strategic bombing, it is very curious indeed how little thought was actually given to the military practice of it. I mean, in fairness, the task of modernising and expanding the bomber force was a pretty huge one to begin with. So that was a very major management job to put that through. So yes, you can see how other things got left out, but that's still, I'm afraid, no excuse.
One of the things as well that I found fascinating in the book is this thought of rearming without looking like you're rearming, because you need to build this force up. And we're talking, is it quadrupling the size of the RAF? Was it initially?
Oh, I lose track of
It yeah,
exactly the number.
it's making it big, but how to do that without looking like you're doing that? I thought that was a very fascinating sort of subsection. It was in one of the schemes that you talk about. Is that something that's very much on their mind, that they want to do this but not sort of rattle the cages of anyone?
Again, this is one of the great question marks, the thinking of the Royal Air Force. In practice, one of deterrence and deterrence only. It's very difficult to get any hard and fast source, but quite naturally, people were not hoping that the material was ever going to be used in combat. And certainly the politicians, Neville Chamberlain above all, had great hopes that war could be entirely avoided. So, at an extreme analysis, you might say, the Royal Air Force was being built up as a parade force rather than a combat force. The other thing, which is, of course, very relevant, is how the bomber gets depicted as a defensive weapon. Because this is part of the rhetoric that keeps coming through again and again, that the only way to defend is by having bombers, is by the threat of counter-bombing. But this is a defensive thing. How sincere any of this is, it's very, very difficult to tell. But the notion that it was actually fighter aircraft which was going to provide the defence was absent. As I said earlier on, the vision of the war, both amongst the politicians and the air staff, was it was going to be a bombing war. The exact role of fighters was kind of indeterminate. And it's only in the immediate aftermath of Munich, where Neville Chamberlain is trying to preserve peace for the peace for our time that he negotiated with Hitler, that he actually says, actually, it's a bit funny, this idea that we're building bombers to defend ourselves. Surely they are offensive weapons, which is a piece of joined up thinking which was hugely absent from any of the of rearmament up till then.
We're just going to take a short break for a quick message from our friends.
Hello there, I'm Matthew Moss from Fighting on Film, the podcast for war movie fans. From the beaches of Normandy to the days of chivalry and swords, if it's been captured on film, we aim to cover it. Featuring top guests from the world of entertainment, historians and industry insiders, we bring you a unique look at the films from our favourite genre. Listen wherever you find your podcasts, or find us at fightingonfilm.com.
And we're back with Adrian Phillips discussing his book, Rearming the RAF for the Second World War.
Let's get to that important date of Munich in September 1938, because one of the things that happens is there is a phased standing up of the three forces. And in the RAF, it doesn't go well for the Prime Service, does it? Fighter Command spins up quite well, but Bomber Command, not so much. What was the sort of reaction to that as the two main parts of the Air Force reacting to the call?
And it was noted, but internally, I don't think there is any sign that any of the difference in performance between fighter and bomber commands ever got outside the Royal Air Force. And it was certainly part of something that had been observed even before Munich, that partly because switching to multi-engine big crew bombers was a much larger task. Bomber Command was lagging in terms of the implementation of rearmament, and this continued right up till September 1939. I don't think anybody spotted that Fighter Command had actually done as good a job as it had during the Munich crisis. Nobody was following on from that, saying, well, maybe we could be exaggerating what damage the Luftwaffe could be doing to London because we've actually got a pretty decent fighter defence force. which was objectively the case. But it's one of those instances where perception of what an armed force had lagged well behind the reality.
So there was no analysis done in that lull between Munich and the start of the war the following year of how they actually performed in doing this. It was just...
No, and what happened immediately after Munich is that obviously with war that much closer, there was going to be more money for the armed services. And there is a great moment when Kingsley Wood, the air minister, says to the air marshals, "Now's the moment. My colleagues are on your side. Open your mouths jolly wide." Now, part of the legend is that after Munich there was a big switch to fighters, and certainly it was planned to go from 600 fighters to 800. That's one part of it, but the other part of it is that it was after Munich that the RAF said, this is the moment to follow our goal and go to an all-heavy bomber force. It's part of the picture which is extremely important and often, well, I'm not sure how well known it is, but the RAF intended to migrate to a 100% heavy bomber force. And this is what was begun after Munich. And in terms of money, in terms of industrial resources, this was going to absorb a lot more funds than pushing Fighter Command up to 800 aircraft. On top of which, some of the specifics of building up Fighter Command were not very impressive at all.
And when we're meaning heavy bombers, they're not necessarily the heavy bombers that we come to know by 1942. The definition of a heavy is... what, a Manchester, isn't it? It's not what we would then see much later with the four-engined one. So at this initial point, it's not exactly heavy, because you define medium heavy, and there's heavy's used a lot, but heavy is not necessarily heavy. That is a terrible question, but I hope you get what I mean.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, there is this great vagueness of nomenclature. I mean, Battles and Blenheims are called medium bombers to distinguish them from Hearts, even though we all think of them as light bombers. But no, in practice, the Stirlings, Halifaxes, and Manchester/Lancasters were heavy bombers, with bomb loads up to 14,000 pounds. In practice, the Stirling was the one that was nominally a heavy bomber, but that was because it was a four-engine design. The two-engine designs were pretty much as capable. It's just that because the Rolls-Royce Vulture engine failed, they ended up being four-engine bombers. So with hindsight, the bomber force that the RAF wanted to build up post-Munich was, in practice, a four-engine bomber force.
And yet, as they're building this up, they're again projecting what they believe the war is going to be. So that's why we see aircraft like the Defiant come out. They're expecting bomber streams to be coming over the North Sea, so therefore, without fighter escorts, they could have something that is specifically designed to position itself and then shoot, as opposed to get in and get out very quickly. You start seeing these designs come through, and I think I've phrased this section, the good, the bad, and the ugly of interwar procurement, because we've mentioned Battle, you've got Defiance, Hayford, which is just a mess, before you even get to things like Manchester, which has its own inherent issues, but is able to get out of it.
I think conceptually, the Defiant was the worst. The Royal Flying Corps had done terribly well with a two-seat fighter, the Bristol fighter, and that spirit rather continued. I thought, well, maybe the most efficient fighter is one with, in the jargon, free guns. So there was a huge head of steam in favour of turret-armed fighters. You get papers in which it said, well, the whole fighter force will be a turret fighter force. And it was intended that Defiance would make up a quarter or one-third of Fighter Command. It's just that Perhaps fortunately there were technical problems getting the Defiant in the air, so it was a smaller disaster than it might have been. But no, I'm afraid that Sir Cyril Newall, the chief of the air staff from 1937 onwards, was a very poor judge of what aeroplanes were going to be. And I think his fate in the Defiant was possibly the worst of his mistakes.
Is there also an element of keeping industry going, much that happened post-war as well, that there's a lot of companies with a lot of people employed, the pie has to be shared out amongst many of them, hence you have so many different engine types, you have lots of weird and wonderful aircraft coming through which are there to bolster numbers as opposed to actually be a forward-thinking aircraft that could go on to being frontline?
Well, it's a permanent problem in any kind of weapons program. You always lose numbers switching to new designs. And so if you're saying we need X planes quickly, the way to do that is keep existing designs in production. And in the case of the Royal Air Force's rearmament, the big beneficiary, for want of a better word, of that was the Fairey Battle, because everything was jigged up. There was a shadow factory coming on stream. That was the easy way to keep the numbers growing, and of course, factories don't keep going idle all the time. There is no labour conscription, so if the workers don't have work, they will move on to something else. So you've got, it's also not so much a paradox, but conflict between keeping up production of existing types and producing new types. And partly because Bomber Command was heading towards an all-heavy bomber force, that's to say, planes which only had their maiden flights in 1939 and were not going to enter service in any number till 1941 at the very earliest. You got what were in practice interim types, Battles, Blenheims, Hamdens and Whitleys produced. It was almost a piece of good luck that you had the Wellington, which was in that kind of semi-interim bracket, which was a pretty decent aeroplane and was able to do good work, not spectacular work, but good work, right up till 1943.
So the subtitle of your book is Poor Strategy and Miscalculation, but I suppose let's sort of start looking towards what they did get right in this period, because one of the things that's always fascinated me is that there's no truly clean paper design coming into service with the RAF that hadn't been started pre-war. So was there anything done well during this period that allowed them to at least set the groundwork for the types that the public would come to know and love going forward?
The Spitfire and Hurricane were extremely good aircraft. The Hurricane was still well up to it in 1941 and the Spitfire all the way through. So those were correct designs. Though, again, I must point out that Chief of the Air Staff, Newall, was thinking that they were obsolete or certainly Hurricanes were obsolete in 1938 already. So that was a bit of a misjudgment. And the heavy...
Well, he did have Cam whispering in his ear to do a new fighter.
Oh yes, and that was coming along. That was the Typhoon and the Tornado were already there, but it was just that his judgment of how fast fighters were going to become obsolete was incorrect.
I have to work the Typhoon into every single one of my podcasts.
Yeah,
everybody's having a drink now.
Yeah, and yes, the Typhoon had been planned before the war, but its success as, in the modern jargon, a strike aircraft was just not there. Plus, of course, there was no thought of using single-engine, single-seat aircraft in that kind of role. It was just a happy chance that the Typhoon was able to do that job, in the same way that the P-51 was able to do the tactical reconnaissance job. The other types which did work to do their job were, I'm going to call them the heavy bombers, which were I'll call them the 1936 generation of heavy bombers, because when they'd migrated into being four-engined Halifaxes and the Avro Lancaster, were very, very good strategic night bombers. The drawback was that they were only really available in 1942 and only really effective in 1943, which was a bit late for what Britain needed.
Could we say that those issues for when they came on stream in 42, 43 were laid with the decisions made in the period that you discuss in your book, that there was a little bit of unfocus there, and that led to a much elongated development to get to where they were going?
The one real blind alley was the Rolls-Royce Vulture. If the Rolls-Royce Vulture had worked, you'd have had effective Manchesters and twin-engined Halifaxes, possibly in the front line in 1941. But that was just, if you like, the chance of gambling very heavily on a single engine type. And the concept of the four-engine bomber was perfectly sound. The problem was that the beneficiary was the short Stirling, which was not a very good aircraft. So yes, the right decisions were taken, or correct decisions were taken, but A, they took a long time to implement, and B, it was a lot more difficult. That, of course, is aiming off for the whole question of bomber technology, where Bomber Command was light years behind Fighter Command, where, again, to go back to an earlier point, there was very much a single piece of hardware mentality about things. All you needed was the aeroplane to do the job, and that was it. The fact that you're going to need navigational aids, bombing aids, and so on and so forth was just not present. And it took hard and bitter experience till any of that started being developed.
The focus that I found interesting in your book is Fighter Command's building this integrated system, and yet the RAF as a whole isn't looking to the infrastructure that's going to support the entire force. You talk about the sort of navigation systems being built in the States and on the continent, but there's not any of that happening here in the UK. And I've that never had really twigged in my mind before, that there's these isolated elements of control being built, but as a whole, there's this gap that should have been quite clear, but wasn't because of the tools being looked at with such force.
There was one particular issue, which was work allocation within aircraft. The head of Bomber Command, Sir Edgar Ludlow Hewitt, had an almost nautical approach to it, that the captain of the aeroplane was responsible for every aspect of its performance, and therefore he was responsible for its navigation, which is only partly true. What it did contribute to was the fact that it took a long time to develop aircraft navigation as a separate speciality that had to be performed by individuals with specific training and pretty much pilot level competence and abilities, which came very, very quickly once the war had broken out and once it became obvious what was needed. But the thinking or even exercise experience that would have showed that was the way forward before the war was just not present.
And the thought of a non-commissioned officer in command of an aircraft would have had him kept awake at night, wouldn't it?
Absolutely. And that was the great thing, that whilst you did have some sergeant pilots before the war, once they'd done their flying duties, they reverted to the rank of corporal, albeit with wings on their chest. It was possibly not as hidebound as the army in terms of its deference to the British class system, but you can't ignore that as a disadvantage that it faced.
So to wrap up, and I have just to say once again, I've thoroughly enjoyed reading your book. What do you think the outcome of this was? What foundations were built for this to take the RAF forward into their next procurement as it leapt forward? Did they learn any lessons, or did they make the same mistakes again?
Like almost anything in war, it's combat that is the great teacher. And it was only when the RAF was called on to support the Army and the Royal Navy in the Middle East from 1941 onwards that you started getting the real education of how air power is actually a much more flexible military tool than was hardwired into the RAF between the wars. And that was the great lesson that was learned and finally applied. But it took time and actual combat to get that far.
I would like to thank Adrian for joining me on the Damcasters. I found his book insightful and challenging to some of my opinions. What could have been a very dry analysis of interwar procurement is made very readable, and I hope, as you've heard today, Adrian does not hold back. That it also has caused quite a stir online is something to be celebrated too, as a good Twitter fight is always enjoyable. Rearming the RAF for the Second World War, Poor Strategy and Miscalculation is out now from Pen and Sword, who kindly provided me with a copy for my chat with Adrian. As always, you can grab a copy at the Boney Abroad Podcast Bookshop, for which there's a link below in the description. 10% of every purchase goes towards supporting the podcast and supporting independent bookshops. Next time on the Damcasters, we are joined by Esther Obby of Air Corps Library, who is in the process of digitizing and conserving the most incredible cache of original North American aviation drawings and schematics. It's a fascinating conversation, and I hope you will join us for it. If you've enjoyed the podcast and would like to support us going forward, you can via Patreon. Tiers start from just £3 a month plus the VAT, and you get all of our episodes on a dedicated feed, ad-free, before they head out into the wider world. Not only that, you'll get a hand-scrolled thank you card from me, which is designed by the great Mark Waters at aircraft.co.uk. There's a Discord channel where you can chat as well, and all of this you can find on Patreon if you head to patreon.com/the Damcasters, all one word. Thank you for your support, and until next time, do take care of yourselves. The Damcasters is hosted and produced by Matt Bone, and it is a Boney Abroad podcast production. To check out our other podcasts, head to boneyabroad.com.